An attorney that has specialized in constitutional law, a member of the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. He is the author of several monographs and books on constitutional money, which provide a scholarly study of United States coin and currency. In other words, he studies constitutional money, and he knows a lot about it, and provides a scholarly study of the U.S. currency and colonial coin. He's a frequent guest on radio and TV talk shows, highly sought-after public speaker, very familiar face here in New Hampshire each year to celebrate the original intent of the Constitution. And according to Dr. Vieira, our country is in jeopardy. And that jeopardy can only be restored by we the people. Let's welcome Dr. Vieira.
Thank you, Diane, members of the Board of Directors of the Center. It's always a privilege, an honor, and a very great pleasure for me to introduce this audience because I enjoy speaking to the choir. Now, you've already heard the theme of this conference, that Patrick Henry, a man who never minced words, admonished his countrymen to guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Doubtlessly, every patriot in that era knew precisely what he meant. Now, today, Americans have constantly thrust at them the term Homeland Security, with the tacit assumption in this barrage of propaganda that everyone knows what Homeland Security means. To be sure, no contemporary patriot could complain if attaining Homeland Security entailed guarding with jealous attention the public liberty, as Patrick Henry understood those words. But apparently the purveyors of Homeland Security expect Americans to deduce its meaning from our nation's more recent experiences. Well, very well. When during the 20th century has America enjoyed a state of affairs that could rightly be called Homeland Security? Consider the numerous military conflicts in which this country has participated. All were fought ostensibly for reasons of national security. Some were won, and at least a superficial level they may have been. Some were admittedly lost. Yet at the most fundamental level, in the long term, each and every one of them brought with it a major defeat for America's true Homeland Security, with fateful consequences at home and abroad. This is because a war is not won or lost only on the battlefields, but also, perhaps especially, in the state of affairs that flow from it into the future. Ostensibly, winning a war is never as important as preserving America's political principles and institutions. Winning a war can never be an excuse to disregard, to subvert, and especially to destroy those principles and institutions. Indeed, winning a war depends upon preserving, protecting, and passing on to future generations those principles and institutions intact and vibrant. So now let us quickly pursue the historical record. In World War I, the rhetoric was quite stirring. It was the war to end all wars, and the war to make the world safe for democracy. The reality, however, was that neither of these grandiose goals was achieved. America's involvement as a participant in the fighting, rather than as a neutral mediator, guaranteed the destruction of the old order and the future stability of Europe. Several monarchies were toppled: Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary. But they were not replaced with stable democracies. Rather, the collapse of Russia unleashed Bolshevism. The economic, political, and social chaos that descended upon Germany led to Hitlerism. And the Treaty of Versailles generated revanchism throughout Central Europe, which sowed the dragon's teeth for a future, even more destructive war. The only apparent success was the establishment of the League of Nations. But this was a success only for proponents of world government. As such, it was a direct attack on America's national independence. For a dangerous fallacy, and even folly, lurked at the heart of the slogan, the war to end all wars. If there were to be no more wars, it could only be because no nation could launch a war, which would require international disarmament, permanently enforced, which would require a world superstate with irresistible police powers. Moreover, a dangerous fallacy and folly as well lurked at the heart of the slogan, "The war to make the world safe for democracy." If democracy was to be brought to the whole world, presumably by some supranational organization, that would include America too. But as we all know, America is not a democracy, but a constitutional federal republic. America cannot become a democracy without destroying what is uniquely American. So either the American proponents of this slogan do not understand their own country's special political nature and legal structure, or they intended to change them radically, indeed to destroy them. In Europe, World War II actually started when Hitler and Stalin signed their 1939 pact that set the stage for their joint invasion, conquest, and partition of Poland. Yet America then found herself allied with Stalin, one of the original aggressors. And in the end, Stalin not only won his war against Hitler, but was allowed to keep everything for which he had bargained in 1939, and to absorb a great deal more throughout Eastern Europe. In Asia, the World War II started over the Japanese incursion into China. Maintaining the territorial integrity of China was America's professed foreign policy goal in that area. In addition to this, the ongoing Chinese Civil War posed the second great threat of international communism. At Yalta, however, Franklin Roosevelt invited Stalin into the Asiatic War. With Stalin's assistance, Mao Zedong's communists took over mainland China, driving the nationalists to Taiwan, and thus obliterating the territorial integrity of China. And another nation of the war's Big Four became a totalitarian communist state. The sole unalloyed success of World War II, but again only for the globalists, was the formation of another, even more extensive apparatus for world government, the United Nations. But united in what? When one of the two original aggressors of World War II sat in the Security Council. And what nation did the dark powers behind this apparatus expect would survive its intended evolution? Was it not designed eventually to subordinate all nations to its control and then to supplant them with a supranational apparatus? Well, of course, the Korean police action and the Vietnamese conflict were also direct results of the loss of World War II in China. And the results of those conflicts speak for themselves. Now America is embroiled in a conflict in the Middle East, which its proponents promise will be an endless war of civilizations, with this country pitted against 1.5 billion Muslims until either Islam or America is destroyed. This record shows, to me at least, that America's homeland security has steadily decreased over the years. Under Woodrow Wilson, time of World War I, in support of interventionism, Americans were sold a bill of goods that the quarrels of the world were their quarrels, in which they must become involved at whatever cost in blood and treasure. Again, this was aimed at promoting globalism, at that time through America's involvement in the League of Nations. That trick didn't work then. But the siren song of internationalism has remained the constant theme of every administration since then. Importantly as well, Wilson oversaw the creation of both the individual income tax, which laid the subflooring in the comprehensive national surveillance state that the dark powers were planning, and also the Federal Reserve System, which erected the superstructure of monetary and banking fascism in America, without which her involvement in World War I and in later conflicts as well could never have been financed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt promoted more globalism through the United Nations. Although the Federal Reserve System had failed in 1932, he gave it even more power and used the collapse of the banks as an excuse to exert even more financial control over individuals through the gold seizure, the suppression of gold contracts. And he ushered in the national dependency state with Social Security. Overall, Roosevelt promised Americans freedom from want and freedom from fear. And now they suffer more fear than ever, and soon they will know increasing want. Of course, under Lyndon Johnson, the great snake oil salesman, Americans were sold the idea that they could have both bread and bullets, both the massive governmental expenditures of Johnson's Great Society and the extensive and expensive slaughter of the Vietnamese conflict. And this childish swindle, as Roosevelt had taught him, was floated on the confidence game of fiat currency inflationism. Now under George W. Bush, America has retrogressed from a limited war in part of Southeast Asia that proved to be unwinnable in the way it was fought, to an unlimited, never-ending conflict with 1.5 billion Muslims throughout the world, which is unwinnable no matter how it is fought. Meanwhile, America's most dangerous enemies here at home, as they always are working tirelessly behind the scenes to submerge this country in the North American Union. This globalist scheme is even worse than the League of Nations or the United Nations, for both of them at least pretended to accept the continued existence of the various nations that compose them, whereas the North American Union is openly designed to end America's national independence and her unique form of constitutionalism entirely and forever. And to ensure that Americans can do nothing about their country's imminent demise, the globalists are asserting more and more claims of war powers, emergency powers, inherent powers of the commander-in-chief, even powers of martial law, which are to be exercised through abolition of the posse comitatus doctrine, through the establishment of military commissions, through the paramilitarization of state and local police, through domestic espionage by an unlimited surveillance state, and finally by repression of dissenters, all under color of fighting the endless global war on terrorism. This rather lugubrious history can be summed up in the term black hole politics. All unchecked political power gravitates toward a central high point and intensifies, while all undefended liberty gravitates toward a low point from which none escapes. The sequence in this country involves, first, concentration of power in the general government at the expense of the states and we the people. Then centralization of power in the executive branch. Then localization of power in the president, the so-called decider, if we can use the current term. And finally, paramilitarization of the whole apparatus from top to bottom, with black uniformed thugs loyal to the leader. While, of course, the Constitution is systematically degraded to a largely ceremonial document that controls the procedures for elections of public officials, but then imposes next to no limits on their behavior. Although none of this has provided security for the American people, but instead has led to ever-increasing insecurity, it has gone on, and promises to go on into the indefinite future. Why? Well, notice how natural it has been to speak of all of these episodes in terms of specific leaders, such as Wilson, or Roosevelt, or Johnson, or Bush. So natural that it compels the conclusion, at least in my mind, that this litany of woe has resulted from the American peoples having acquiesced and continuing to acquiesce in misrule by the leader principle, or in the language most appropriate for expressing it, das Führerprinzip. It's not funny. To provide true homeland security, Americans need to put into place, and even more importantly, to put into operation, institutions that minimize the opportunity for the leader principle to come into play, if not to preclude it and to exclude it altogether. Of course, Americans already know how to do that. American constitutionalism is the very opposite of the leader principle, and therefore it is the true source of homeland security. Under the leader principle, anything can happen, depending on the intelligence, the talents, the psychology, the character, or in recent examples, the appetites and vices of the leader. This situation is the essence of political and economic insecurity. In contrast, under the Constitution, Americans know what must happen, or at least what is supposed to happen, what should happen. This situation is not one of changing and unpredictably changeable leaders, but of laws. This is the essence of political and economic security. So the Constitution being the key to the matter, exactly what does it say about security? The only place in the Constitution where the word security appears is in the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Notice, though, not just security in some abstract sense, but the security of a free state. This and this alone is the definition, the proper definition, of homeland security. The security of America as a free state. Moreover, a well-regulated militia is necessary for such security. And all of these, a free state, its security, a well-regulated militia, are linked in a cause and effect relationship to the people, not to some leader. In particular, all of them are linked specifically to the people's exercise of the power of the sword, the right to keep and bear arms. The right of the people to keep and bear arms as against whom? As against public officials, of course. The right of the people to keep and bear arms represents the ability of the principals to exercise power, if necessary firepower, against their own rogue agents. The Second Amendment directs that public officials shall be absolutely subject to the people in the most important particular possible, control over the instruments of political force. Thus, the Second Amendment rather starkly excludes the leader principle and takes as its foundation the people principle. Under the original Constitution, although the word security is never used, the essential elements of Homeland Security are laid out quite clearly in the preamble. First, a more perfect union. Not the creation of artificial divisions and synthetic strife within society as through the balkanization of this country by means of multiculturalism and pluralism and those other techniques of divide and rule. Secondly, justice. The result of applying those just powers that the Declaration of Independence tells us governments derive from the consent of the governed, and that stem originally from the moral and theological precepts of the laws of nature and of nature's God. Third, domestic tranquility. Not just the absence of turmoil, but as the Declaration of Independence recites, a state of affairs that allows for every man to engage in the pursuit of happiness. That is, a social and political context in which all men of goodwill can live peaceful and prosperous lives. Then the common defense. Not aggression and neo-imperialism, but America first, second, and third. Then the general welfare, not the prostitution of government to pander to special interests, but the exclusion of factions from the public council. And last but not least, the blessings of liberty, not a police state, a surveillance state, or a national security state, but a free state in which we, the people themselves, hold in their own hands the ultimate power. Well, what are the structures that the Constitution provides to attain this vision of Homeland Security? They are what I'd like to call the 7 pillars of political or American political wisdom. The first pillar, we the people as sovereigns, who alone enjoy the authority to set up or to change the government. This appears explicitly in the Constitution. We the people do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This in turn results from the broader principle stated in the Declaration of Independence that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The second pillar, we the people as electors, who choose individuals to administer the government from day to day. The third, fourth, and fifth pillars, we the people's agents for national concerns, Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, and the rest of the judiciary. The sixth pillar, we the people's agents for local concerns, the states. And last but not least, the seventh pillar, we the people organized in and able to act at all times through the militia of the several states. Nowhere in this structure does the leader principle appear. Nowhere. Every pillar of the Constitution and of the Declaration of Independence from which the Constitution draws its authority is based upon the people principle, the principle of self-government by we the people. In this structure, public officials are only and always agents, never principals. Strictly speaking, they are only and always followers of the instructions of others, never true leaders. Now let us turn specifically to the militia of the several states. If an architect's plan requires a certain structural element, it must be necessary. If necessary, it must be included in the building. And having been put in, it cannot be pulled out or allowed to fall into disrepair, let alone to decay entirely. Now apply that analogy to the Second Amendment. If, as the amendment declares, a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, then it is an essential element of that security. Therefore, a free state can be, indeed it should be, defined as one that has a well-regulated militia. The very existence of a free state depends upon its having a well-regulated militia at all times. Now, the militia appear not only in the Second Amendment, but also in the original Constitution, which to my mind is a rather striking fact, because the militia are the only subject as to which the original Constitution and an amendment cover the same ground and reinforce one another. And you might want to check that, the only subject of that kind. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, the Constitution delegates to Congress the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Few lists of the essential elements of Homeland Security could be as succinct and yet as sweeping. Moreover, this enumeration emphasizes the proper priority. For first and foremost, it places the militia's authority and responsibility to execute the laws of the Union. Under the Constitution, the test of power is always its conformity with law. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, the Constitution delegates to Congress the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Now, typical of the whole Constitution, this power builds upon the foundation of federalism, not centralism. Yes, it's true, Congress's authority is designed to promote a general uniformity, yet the ultimate authority, command, and control effectively remain with the states, to which are reserved the appointment of the officers. We have no trace of the modern leader principle in this provision. Well, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution invests the President with the office of Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Even here, the original Constitution rejects the leader principle. For contrary to certain confused notions that are popular today in the disgrace of Columbia, the powers of the Commander-in-Chief are quite limited. In this particular, the Constitution radically departed from the monarch principle, the form the leader principle took in the late 1700s. Under pre-constitutional English law, the king, the so-called unitary executive of his time, or the decider, if you will, of his time, enjoyed exclusive personal control over war and peace, the army, the navy, and the militia. All of these powers the Constitution shifted from the executive branch of government to the legislative branch of government by explicitly delegating them to Congress and thereby absolutely withholding them from the President. It is no accident that the Constitution rejects the leader principle. First, as the Declaration of Independence recites, a true government can exercise only just powers. Just powers derive not from leaders, but from the laws of nature and of nature's God, which are superior to and control the actions of all leaders. Second, even a true government exercising only just powers is merely an apparatus. It's a collection of agents of we the people. Any government is simply a reflection of the people. If the people cannot lead themselves, the agents they select can do no better. So to look to government, the mere apparatus for leadership, that is for political and especially moral purpose, is essentially to look at a mirage. Now, true enough, it may also prove a mirage to look to the people when too many of them become corrupt. If and when that happens, this country may have to follow the counsel of St. Augustine, who said, if the people have a sense of moderation and responsibility and are most careful guardians of the commonweal, it is right to enact a law allowing such a people to choose their own magistrates for the government of the commonwealth. But if, as time goes on, the same people become so corrupt as to sell their votes and entrust the government to scoundrels and criminals, then the right of appointing their public officials is rightly forfeit to such a people, and the choice devolves to a few good men. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, however, presume that such irremediable corruption has not taken place in America, and that if it ever begins to do so, the constitutional system of checks and balances can and will correct the situation before it is too late. That is, if that system is put into operation. America's most pressing problem today is that the leader principle has taken a strangulating hold on the political process. It has been the source of insecurity decade after decade, and if allowed to continue, it will be the cause of disaster and probably the utter destruction of this country. To establish constitutional homeland security, the security of a free state, America needs a resounding rejection of the leader principle and a rapid return to the people principle. Self-government by we the people themselves at all times. This would be necessary even if someone such as Ron Paul, or perhaps some of the other individuals we had here tonight, were elected president. Well, such an individual would be more than simply a constitutional president. He would be a constitutionalist president. As such, he would know the boundaries that the Constitution sets to presidential authority, and he would stay well within them. Within the general government, he would promote separation of powers, not concentration of powers. Between the general government and the states, he would promote federalism, not centralism. And overall, he would promote popular self-government, not rule by the leader principle, by taking two major steps. First, securing the power of the purse in we the people's hands, not in the hands of a fascist banking cartel. And secondly, securing the power of the sword in we the people's hands, not in the hands of standing armies or paramilitarized professional police forces. But to apply these principles and to accomplish these ends, a constitutional president, a constitutionalist president, would have to depend upon we the people's constant, active vigilance and support. At least initially, under present political conditions, Congress would oppose him, the judiciary would oppose him, and the general government's bureaucracy would most assuredly oppose him. So to advance his constitutionalist agenda, such a president would have to turn for support to the states and to we the people. But what are the president's most important constitutional connections to the states and to we the people? First, his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Second, the constitutional responsibility and authority of the militia of the several states to execute the laws of the Union. And third, tying them both together, the president's authority as commander-in-chief of the militia when called into the actual service of the United States. Thus, even, especially, with someone such as Representative Paul as president, the absolutely necessary mechanism to establish constitutional homeland security by restoring self-government to this country would be the revitalization of the militia of the several states. The militia are the essential statement of popular self-government, with the power of the sword always in we the people's hands. Thus they are the refutation of the leader principle. The militia are invested not just with legal, but even constitutional authority. They are parts of each state's government at all times, and of the general government when called into the actual service of the United States, and they are composed of the true sovereigns of this country. The militia are permanent establishments, recognized as such by the Constitution, no less than the permanent establishments of the states themselves. Being permanent constitutional establishments, the militia are not beholden to public officials, politicians, political parties, special interest groups, the big media, or the intelligentsia. And the militia are unifying forces based on universal rights and especially universal duties, aimed ultimately at achieving the common defense and the general welfare. Because they enroll individuals from throughout the community, they are the very antitheses and implacable antagonists of all narrow factions, parties, and special interest groups, domestic and foreign. Thus, their very existence would thwart the divide and rule tactics of America's domestic enemies. But today, the militia of the several states, the only one of the 7 pillars that the Constitution itself declares to be necessary for security, are not being used to carry their share of the load of constitutional checks and balances. Indeed, they're not being used at all. Why has this happened? Well, no doubt there are several reasons, including ignorance, which points up the need for public education, such as we're trying to do here through the center. But even with education, we must contend with apathy. All too many people assume that nothing can be done to retard, let alone to reverse, America's decline. And we must contend with sloth. All too many people are content to be bystanders to self-government rather than active participants. And we must contend with irresponsibility. All too many people refuse to recognize the personal duty to their communities that self-government entails. And we must contend with avarice. All too many people are economic collaborators who feed at the trough of globalist big business, which soon leads to their political collaboration as well. And worst of all, we must contend with malign political interests. Almost all present-day politicians and their controllers and special interest groups will work to thwart the very effective constitutional check and balance on their misbehavior that the militia would provide. Well, whatever the reasons for this unacceptable situation, Americans must now ask themselves what can be done, what must be done. For what can Americans expect when one structural part, and in the architect's own estimation, the most important part of their constitutional edifice is allowed to fall not just into disuse, but into disrepair, decay, and even disrespect? Self-evidently, the result must be a failure of the edifice as a whole. And not just a failure, but a catastrophic failure. So revitalization of the militia of the several states is not optional. It has to be done, immediately, if not sooner. Fortunately, now is a particularly propitious time for action because of mounting public concern about Homeland Security and mounting public fear that the dark powers in the disgrace of Colombia intend to use Homeland Security as an excuse to set up a national paramilitary police state. Under these circumstances, the time is ripe for popular education as to what constitutional Homeland Security really is, popular involvement in actions aimed at revitalizing the militia of the several states, popular preparation of the necessary legislation, popular pressure on legislators to enact that legislation, popular participation in the militia once they have been revitalized, and then popular expansion of the movement state by state across the country. So, there is the answer. To guard with jealous attention the public liberty demands participation by the public in self-government at all times. The militia of the several states can provide the means to achieve that end. Revitalization of the militia can, and I believe will be, the process that restores the spirit and then the substance of self-government to this country. Now there needs to be action. The best tool is useless unless and until it is taken up and put to work. Earlier I quoted St. Augustine, who warned that if as time goes on the people become so corrupt as to sell their votes and entrust the government to scoundrels and criminals, then the right of appointing their public officials is rightly forfeit to such a people, and the choice devolves to a few good men. Well, whether most, or perhaps I should say too many Americans, are already so corrupt as to surrender their government to scoundrels and criminals is a matter that only the future can reveal, and it's a future that's not that far off. I, however, remain confident that Americans can and will prove to a doubting world that they are still capable of self-government by actually governing themselves. The best way left to them to evidence their rectitude and their resolve is to revitalize the militia of the several states according to strict constitutional principles. No shortcuts, no compromises, no ifs, no ands, no buts. Americans cannot improve on the determination expressed by the greatest of Indian patriots, Tecumseh, who said, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is His will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." One hopes that some of the people in this room will be among those who will do what is necessary. Thank you.